I want to begin by being careful about my own title, because China is building the next financial system, and the dollar isn't in it, is a phrase that can be read as a far larger claim than I intend. So let me foreclose the misreading immediately. When I say the dollar isn't in it, I do not mean that the dollar is being replaced, and I do not mean that this new system is now dominant, because it is neither, and the dollar remains, by an enormous margin, the dominant currency in the world. And I am not predicting its imminent displacement. And I am equally not saying that what is being built is nothing, a curiosity with tiny adoption that can be safely ignored, because that dismissal misses the entire point. What I mean by the dollar isn't in it is something precise and I think genuinely important, and it is this. What is being built is infrastructure, the rails, the plumbing of an alternative financial system being built without the dollar at its center, and the significance of infrastructure lies not in its current level of adoption, but in the option it creates. Once a viable dollar-free alternative exists, even one that is far from dominant, the strategic landscape changes because parties gain an option they did not have before, and options, once they exist, reshape behavior long before they are fully used. That is the subject. Not that the dollar is finished, which it is not, but that the deep infrastructural layer of the financial system is being rebuilt in a way that creates an option, and that the mere existence of that option matters more than most people focused on adoption numbers are willing to see. Let me be careful, as always, about the two extremes, because this subject pulls people hard toward one of them, and both are wrong. The first extreme is the doom or triumphalist narrative. The reading of the dollar isn't in it as a claim that the dollar is being replaced, that the alternative has arrived, that it is over, and this is wrong, because the new system is far from dominant and the dollar's position remains overwhelming. And predicting its imminent displacement is exactly the overclaim that has discredited so many. And the second extreme is the dismissive one, the insistence that adoption is tiny, that the alternative is barely used, that a system with a small share of global transactions is a nothing to be ignored. And this is also wrong because it conflates current adoption with strategic significance, and infrastructure, as I will argue, changes the landscape even at low adoption through the option it creates rather than the volume it currently carries. The truth is, neither replacement nor irrelevance. The truth is that infrastructure is being built, that it is far from dominant, and that its mere existence as a viable alternative is strategically significant in a way that adoption numbers do not capture. And the interesting and useful thing is understanding why the infrastructure layer matters so much and why a built option reshapes the landscape before it is exercised. So let me start with the layer that most discussion misses, the plumbing, because it is the deep layer of monetary power and it is genuinely underappreciated. Most discussion of the dollar focuses on the currency itself, on its reserve status, on the fiscal numbers, on questions of value and confidence. But beneath all of that is the plumbing, the actual infrastructure through which money moves, the payment systems, the settlement rails, the correspondent banking network, the messaging systems that instruct the transfers, the clearing mechanisms that finalize them. This is the layer through which money actually flows. And it is a layer that most people never think about because it is invisible when it works, the way the plumbing in a building is invisible until something goes wrong. And here is the crucial thing. The dollar's power rests heavily, far more heavily than most people realize, on being the default infrastructure, the rails that everyone uses, so that using the dollar is very often not a choice at all. It is the path of least resistance, because the dollar rails are the well-built path, and there is no comparably built alternative. This infrastructural dominance, the fact that the dollar is the plumbing through which most cross-border money moves, is a huge and underappreciated source of its power, perhaps a larger source than the currency's value or its reserve status, because it operates beneath the level of choice, at the level of the rails themselves. The principles that determine how power operates at the infrastructural layer, how the deep plumbing of a system shapes what is possible above it, are worth studying deliberately and as a connected whole. And there is a body of work that lays them out carefully called the Naval Codex. It is not a forecast and it is not a set of tactics. It is a systematic account of the underlying principles that determine who sees the deep structural layers of a system, the infrastructure that shapes everything above it, rather than attending only to the surface where most people look. If you want to engage with those principles directly, it is linked in the description, and there is a code on the screen you can scan to reach it. And engaging with the principles directly is what matters, because the skill of seeing the infrastructural layer generalizes far beyond any single system, and the systems it applies to will always be different. Now, let me develop the crucial distinction, the one that both extremes get wrong, which is the difference between building infrastructure and achieving dominance. These are not the same thing, and conflating them produces both errors. The doom error conflates them in one direction, reasoning that because the infrastructure is being built, the dollar must be finished, as though building the alternative were the same as the alternative becoming dominant. And the dismissive error conflates them in the other direction, reasoning that because the alternative is not dominant, its being built is insignificant, as though only dominance mattered and the building itself were nothing. And the truth, the thing both miss, is that building infrastructure and achieving dominance are distinct, that the new infrastructure is being built and is far from dominant, and that its being built is nonetheless significant, not because it is dominant, which it is not, but for a different reason entirely, a reason that has to do with optionality rather than dominance. The building creates something real, an option, and the option matters even though dominance has not been achieved. And seeing this requires holding the distinction that both extremes collapse, the distinction between the built and the dominant. So let me develop the core insight, the reason a built alternative creates an option that matters even at low adoption, because this is the heart of the whole thing. The dollar's deepest form of leverage, the ability to weaponize access to the financial system, to exclude parties by denying them the rails, depends entirely on there being no alternative. It works because the dollar rails are the only rails. So that being cut off from them is being cut off from the financial system itself, with nowhere else to go. And the moment a viable alternative exists, even one that is barely used, that leverage diminishes. And here is the crucial point. It diminishes before the alternative is adopted at scale, because what matters is not whether parties are currently using the alternative, but whether they could, whether the option exists. Once a party has the option to route around the dollar, the threat of being cut off from the dollar loses much of its force, because there is now somewhere else to go, and the credible existence of that option changes the calculus even before it is exercised. An option, once it exists, reshapes behavior in advance of its use, because the parties know it is there and they act differently knowing they have it. This is why the dollar isn't in it matters, not because the alternative is dominant, but because its existence creates an option, and the option, merely by existing, alters the strategic landscape, reducing the leverage that depended on there being no alternative, and giving parties a freedom they did not have before, a freedom that shapes their behavior whether or not they currently exercise it. The way capital actually moves as the infrastructural landscape shifts and new options come into being, where it flows and why, and what happens to the leverage that depended on there being no alternative once an alternative exists, is worth understanding in its specific mechanics rather than in vague outline. And there is a framework that traces exactly this, called the Dragon Pivot. Despite the name, it is not really about any single country. It is about how the infrastructure of the monetary order is rebuilt, how options come into being and reshape the landscape, and how those who saw the infrastructural shift early positioned themselves before its significance became widely recognized. You can reach it through the code shown on the screen or through the link in the description for anyone who wants the fuller picture. And that picture matters here precisely because the infrastructural shift operates beneath the surface, where most people look at the level of the rails and the options they create, rather than at the level of adoption numbers that most discussion fixates on. Let me be specific about the rails that are actually being built, because the abstraction needs concrete content. What is being built is a set of alternative financial rails and alternative plumbing. There are the parallel payment systems, comprehensive and sophisticated and domestically controlled, that operate independently of the dollar-based infrastructure. There is the digital form of the currency developed not merely as a domestic payment convenience, but as a potential mechanism for international settlement that bypasses the dollar-based correspondent banking network. There are the bilateral arrangements that allow trade to be settled without dollar intermediation, each one a small piece of alternative plumbing. And there is the extension of financial infrastructure to trading partners, the building out of the rails into the international domain. These are the specific pieces of the alternative infrastructure, the actual plumbing being laid, and none of them is dominant, and their combined adoption is a small share of global transactions. But they are built, or being built, and their existence is the option, the alternative set of rails that did not exist before, and that changes the landscape by existing. This brings me to what all of this means for the individual, because the strategic landscape is shifting at the infrastructure layer, and the lesson for how you position yourself follows directly. The deep lesson is about optionality, about holding options rather than being wholly dependent on a single system's rails, and it applies to the individual as much as to nations. Just as the existence of alternative financial infrastructure gives nations an option that reduces their dependence on a single system, the individual should hold optionality too, should avoid concentrating their entire economic existence in a single system's rails, in a single currency, and a single set of financial assumptions, and should hold genuine productive assets and value that is not wholly dependent on any single infrastructure. The individual who holds only one system's rails is exposed exactly as a nation dependent on one system's rails is exposed, and the individual who holds optionality, genuine productive capability and value, independent of any single arrangement, is positioned for a landscape in which the infrastructure itself is shifting. The work of building a position out of genuine productive capability and value that is not wholly dependent on any single financial infrastructure, holding optionality rather than total concentration in one system's rails, is worth doing systematically. And there's a framework devoted precisely to that called the Sovereign Vault. It is concerned with building durable, generationally significant wealth, grounded in real productive assets and real institutional protection, the kind of position that holds optionality rather than depending entirely on a single system, rather than in the concentration that a single infrastructure assumption mistakes for safety. It is linked below, and the code on the screen will take you straight to it for anyone who wants to go deeper on the question of how to hold optionality at the individual level. And that is the practical core of it, because seeing the infrastructural shift means little if you remain out of habit, wholly concentrated in a single system's rails. Now I want to develop why infrastructure, once built, tends to get used, because the option is not merely theoretical, and this is what makes the building consequential rather than a dormant curiosity. Infrastructure, once built, lowers the cost of using it. This is a general truth about infrastructure. Before the rails exist, using an alternative is prohibitively costly, because there are no rails, and so the option does not really exist in any practical sense. Once the rails are built, the cost of using them falls dramatically, and lowered costs get used when incentives shift, because the barrier that prevented the alternative was the cost, and the built infrastructure removes it. And incentives are shifting. The weaponization of dollar access, the demonstrated willingness to use the dollar rails as a coercive tool, gives parties genuine reasons to use the alternative to route around a system that can be turned against them, and every such incentive, combined with the now lowered cost of the built alternative, makes the exercise of the option more likely, right? So the built infrastructure is not a dormant curiosity that will sit unused. It is an option whose exercise becomes more likely as incentives make routing around the dollar attractive, and the incentives are aligning. The building is the precondition, the laying of the rails that makes the alternative possible, and the using follows when the incentives align. And the incentives are aligning, which means the built infrastructure, mostly unused today, is likely to be used increasingly as the reasons to use it accumulate. I want to spend real time on the even-handedness, because it is where the honesty of the reflection is tested, and the infrastructure claim makes it especially necessary. The dollar's infrastructural dominance is genuinely deep and genuinely hard to displace, and I want to develop this substantially rather than as a token gesture. The dollar rails are the product of decades of accumulation, of network effects so powerful that they're almost self-perpetuating because everyone uses the dollar rails because everyone else uses the dollar rails. And this network effect is enormously difficult to overcome. The depth and liquidity of dollar markets, the ability to move enormous sums with minimal friction, is unmatched, and it is a genuine reason to use the dollar rails that has nothing to do with coercion. The trust and the familiarity built over generations are real assets. And there is no full alternative with the same scale and depth. And so building the alternative infrastructure is not the same as winning. And the dollar's infrastructural moat is real and deep and durable, and it will not be displaced quickly. And the Chinese alternative in particular has genuine limitations, real and serious ones. The capital controls that limit the free flow of the currency, which make it far less useful as a global reserve and settlement medium than a freely convertible currency would be. The shallower markets, which cannot yet carry what the dollar markets carry. The political constraints and the questions about governance that make some parties reluctant to depend on the alternative. And the fundamental question of whether others will actually adopt it at scale, which is far from settled. So the alternative is being built and it creates an option, but it has real limitations, and it's being built is not, it's becoming dominant, and the dollar's infrastructural moat is genuine and durable. The point is not that the dollar is finished. The point is that the strategic landscape is shifting at the infrastructure layer, that a built alternative creates an option even at low adoption, and that this shift is significant even though the dollar remains and will for a long time remain dominant. I want to think honestly about why people miss the infrastructure layer, why the building of the alternative is dismissed even by those watching the currency, because understanding the mechanism is the only defense against it. The first reason is the focus on the currency rather than the plumbing, the tendency to think about the dollar in terms of its value and its reserve status, which are visible and much discussed, rather than in terms of the rails and the settlement systems, which are invisible and rarely discussed, so that the infrastructural layer, where a great deal of the real shift is occurring, goes unattended because attention is fixed on the surface. The second reason is the conflation of not dominant with not significant, the reflex to look at the adoption numbers, to see that the alternative carries a small share of global transactions, and to conclude that it is therefore insignificant, missing entirely the way infrastructure creates optionality that matters at low adoption. The third reason is the genuine difficulty of valuing optionality, because an option that has not yet been exercised is easy to dismiss, it looks like nothing, it carries no volume, and the value of an option, which lies in what it makes possible rather than in what it currently does, is abstract and easily overlooked, especially by an analysis that counts what is happening rather than what could happen. And the fourth reason, the deepest, is the comfort of assuming the dollar's infrastructure is permanent, because it has been the default for so long that its permanence feels like a fact of nature rather than a contingent arrangement. And this assumption of infrastructural permanence makes the building of an alternative seem irrelevant, because if the dollar's rails are permanent, then no alternative could matter. These reasons together explain why the infrastructure layer is missed even by those watching the currency, because the focus is on the surface and the numbers and the comfortable assumption of permanence, and the deep shift at the level of the rails and the optionality it creates goes unseen. I want to be very clear one final time about what I am not saying, because the misreadings here are dangerous and I want to foreclose them. The dollar it is not a claim that the dollar is being replaced or that it is over, because the dollar remains overwhelmingly dominant and the alternative is far from displacing it. And it is not a claim that the alternative has arrived or won, because it is being built, not achieving dominance, and it has real limitations. And it is not a conspiracy, because the building of the alternative infrastructure is public and transparent and openly discussed, driven by the rational responses of parties reducing their dependence rather than by any secret design, right? And it is not essentialism, and it is not a claim about any people. It is a claim about infrastructure and the optionality that a built alternative creates. And it is not doom or panic, because the appropriate response to an infrastructural shift is not fear, but the calm recognition that the landscape is changing at the level of the rails, and the holding of optionality accordingly, which is a considered and prudent act, not an alarmed one. So I want to end, as I always do, not with an exhortation, but with an invitation to see clearly, because this is, in the end, one of the oldest truths there is about power and systems, and it is not new. Infrastructure is the deep layer that determines what is possible above it, and a built alternative creates an option that reshapes the landscape before it becomes dominant. And options, once they exist, get used when the incentives shift. This is not new. What is new is only the specific circumstance, a particular alternative financial infrastructure being built without the dollar at its center, creating an option that reduces the leverage that depended on there being no alternative, and a particular set of incentives that are aligning to make the exercise of that option increasingly likely, and the particular blindness of an analysis that fixes on the currency and the adoption numbers and misses the shift at the level of the rails. The dollar isn't in the new infrastructure, and that matters, not because the dollar is finished, which it is not, but because the option now exists. That is the thing I most want to leave you with. A viable alternative is being built, and its existence, regardless of its current adoption, creates an option that did not exist before, and the option reshapes the landscape by existing, reducing the old leverage and giving parties a freedom that shapes their behavior, whether or not they yet exercise it. Hold optionality yourself at the individual level, as the nations are building it at theirs, refusing to concentrate your entire existence in a single system's rails. See the infrastructure layer beneath the currency and the numbers where the real shift is occurring. And recognize that a built option, mostly unused today, is likely to be used increasingly as the incentives align. And the value of seeing this, of attending to the infrastructural layer and the optionality it creates, while others count only the current volume, invisible for a long time, the way these things always are, through the stretch in which the alternative sits mostly unused and the person who saw its significance appears merely to be overrating a curiosity with tiny adoption, reveals itself the way these things always reveal themselves, which is slowly as the built infrastructure sits as an option while the incentives gradually align, and then suddenly, at the moment, the incentives align enough that the exercise of the option cascades, and the alternative that was built and barely used is used at scale, and the people who saw the infrastructure being laid, who understood that a built option reshapes the landscape before it is exercised, are found to have been, all along, simply the ones who looked beneath the surface to the rails